The temperature in Saigon was pushing 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air was thick with the suffocating humidity of the looming monsoon season. But the sweat on the faces of the men inside the American embassy was purely from cold panic. The date was April 29, 1975. The sound of twin-blade Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopters chopping through the smoggy sky was the only heartbeat left in a dying city. Black smoke billowed from incinerators on the embassy grounds as millions of dollars of classified intelligence, currency, and broken promises were turned to ash. This is the iconic image of the Fall of Saigon, a frantic scramble for the roof, a desperate leap for the last chopper out of town. But military catastrophes of this magnitude do not just happen overnight. They are engineered through years of strategic miscalculations, logistical starvation, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy. Welcome back to the channel. We dig deep into the tactical realities, the industrial logistics, and the brutal truths of military history here. So if you want the unfiltered facts, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and let me know in the comments below. Do you think the collapse of South Vietnam was a failure of the soldiers on the ground, or a failure of the politicians back in Washington? To understand the final 24 hours of America's longest war of the 20th century, we have to rewind the clock and look at the strategic chessboard that was set in the years prior. The writing on the wall was not penned in April 1975, but in January 1973 with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. On paper, it was a ceasefire. In reality, it was an American exit strategy. President Richard Nixon had promised South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thuy that if the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, violated the treaty, the United States would respond with overwhelming air power. Nixon had proven he was willing to do exactly that during Operation Linebacker, II, in 1972, when waves of B-52 Stratofortresses pounded Hanoi into submission and forced them to the negotiating table. But political landscapes shift faster than battle lines. By August 1974, the Watergate scandal forced Nixon to resign, and Gerald Ford inherited a presidency handcuffed by a hostile Congress. The Case Church Amendment had already legally prohibited direct U.S. military involvement in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The American umbrella of close air support, which the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, had been trained to rely on for over a decade, was permanently folded up and locked away. Why build an army entirely dependent on massive air support and unlimited logistics, only to cut the supply line and ground the planes? It is a tactical paradox that we have seen repeat itself in modern history. The sudden collapse of a U.S.-trained proxy force due to a rapid withdrawal of air support, maintenance contractors, and intelligence assets is not unique to 1975. We watched a nearly identical tragic rerun in Kabul, Afghanistan in August 2021. You build a mirror image military, you pull the plug on the power source, and the machine dies. The North Vietnamese Politburo in Hanoi, led by Le Duan, recognized this shift in Washington. They were cautious at first, testing the waters. In January 1975, the NVA launched an assault on Phuoc Long Province, a lightly defended area just 75 miles north of Saigon. They overran the provincial capital, wiped out the ARVN defenders, and waited. They looked at the skies, waiting for the B-52s. They listened to the radio, waiting for the White House to announce a retaliatory strike. Nothing happened. The United States did not lift a finger. For General Van Tien Dung, the commander of the NVA forces, this was the ultimate green light. The Americans were gone and they were not coming back. With the political coast clear, the North Vietnamese initiated a logistical miracle that is rarely given the credit it deserves in Western military academies. We often picture the Viet Cong and the NVA as guys in black pajamas riding bicycles through the jungle, but by 1975, that was an outdated myth. The NVA had transformed into a conventional mechanized combined arms juggernaut. The famous Ho Chi Minh Trail had been upgraded from a series of muddy footpaths into a 12,000-mile network of all-weather, two-lane highways. They built a 3,000-mile-long petroleum pipeline stretching from the north down through the Truong Son Mountains directly into South Vietnam. This pipeline pumped thousands of gallons of diesel fuel and gasoline a day to feed their armor and truck convoys. This was an industrial-scale logistical feat rivaling the famous Red Ball Express that supplied George Patton's Third Army as it raced across France in World War II. The NVA was moving hundreds of Soviet-supplied T-54 main battle tanks and 130mm M46 field guns down this highway. Let us talk about the hardware, because warfare always comes down to metal and physics. The NVA's 130mm artillery piece was a game-changer. It fired a 73-pound high-explosive projectile out to a maximum range of 17 miles. The ARVN, on the other hand, was primarily equipped with American 105mm and 155mm howitzers, which had significantly shorter ranges. In artillery duels, the NVA could sit comfortably out of range and pound ARVN fire bases to dust, and without American F-4 Phantoms or A-6 Intruders to conduct counter-battery airstrikes, the South Vietnamese gunners were sitting ducks. On the armored front, the NVA's T-54 tank, weighing in at 36 tons and armed with a 100mm rifled gun, was a rugged, heavily armored beast perfectly suited for the terrain. The ARVN was fielding the American M48 Patton tank. The M48 was a formidable machine, weighing 49 tons with a 90mm gun, but it was an absolute gas guzzler. A Patton tank gets less than 1 mile to the gallon. When you have a massive fuel pipeline feeding your enemy and your own fuel supplies are being slashed by congressional budget cuts, having a heavy, thirsty tank becomes a tactical liability rather than an asset. The financial strangulation of the South Vietnamese military was absolute. In 1973, U.S. military aid to South Vietnam was $8 billion. By 1975, Congress had slashed it to $700 million. And inflation following the 1973 oil crisis ate up most of that remaining purchasing power. The results on the ground were catastrophic. ARVN soldiers were restricted to firing only 2 artillery shells per gun per day. Infantrymen were issued just a handful of magazines for their M16 rifles. Medical supplies dried up, meaning a wound that was survivable in 1972 was a death sentence in 1975. Trucks and M113 armored personnel carriers sat idle in motor pools because there were no spare parts to fix broken tracks and no fuel to put in the tanks. You cannot fight a mobile mechanized war when your army is effectively tethered to the ground by an empty gas tank. This logistical starvation shattered the morale of the South Vietnamese forces long before the final shots were fired. It is highly reminiscent of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, where a highly trained and capable force was slowly ground-tuned into dust not just by enemy actions, but by a catastrophic failure of their own supply lines and a political leadership that refused to acknowledge reality. The death blow to South Vietnam's strategic posture came in March 1975 during the NVA's Central Highlands campaign. General Van Tien Dung launched a massive surprise attack on the city of Ban My Thuot. The ARVN defenders fought fiercely but were overwhelmed by NVA armor and artillery. In a moment of sheer panic, President Thieu ordered the ARVN forces to withdraw from the Central Highlands and redeploy to defend the coastal cities and Saigon. Retreat is the most difficult military maneuver to execute even for a well-supplied, highly disciplined army. For an army lacking fuel, communication gear, and air cover, it was suicide. The withdrawal down Route 7B turned into the infamous Convoy of Tears. Over 100,000 ARVN soldiers and civilian refugees clogged the dirt road. NVA artillery rained down on the column, and T-54 tanks literally crushed vehicles and people under their treads as they sliced through the retreating masses. The ARVN 2nd Corps was completely annihilated, not in a pitched battle, but in a chaotic, bloody rout. This disaster mirrors the fall of France in 1940, where massive columns of French refugees clogged the road networks, preventing the military from moving reserves into position and allowing the German panzer divisions to bypass strong points and encircle entire armies. The loss of the Central Highlands cut South Vietnam in half. The northern provinces quickly collapsed. The elite ARVN, airborne and marine divisions, the strategic reserve of the entire country, were squandered and decimated in the chaotic defense and subsequent evacuation of Da Nang and Hue. By mid-April, the NVA had captured over $1 billion worth of abandoned American military equipment. They integrated captured M113s and 2.5-ton cargo trucks right into their own columns, using American gasoline to fuel the drive on Saigon. The order of battle for the final assault, codenamed the Ho Chi Minh Campaign, was terrifyingly one-sided. General Van Tien Dung had amassed 4 Army Corps, comprising 18 infantry divisions, supported by hundreds of tanks, heavy artillery, and anti-aircraft regiments, equipped with SA-7 shoulder-fired missiles to swat down any ARVN helicopters that dared to take flight. He had over 130,000 in regular, battle-hardened troops, forming a steel ring around Saigon. Inside the city, the ARVN defense was commanded by General Cao Van Vien and the remnants of the 1st Corps. They had 3 severely battered divisions, the 5th, the 18th, and the 25th, along with scattered ranger groups and airborne battalions. The ARVN forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. Yet, in the face of this overwhelming mechanical and numerical superiority, elements of the ARVN would mount a defense so ferocious at a town called Xuan Loc that it would temporarily stall the communist juggernaut and force the NVA to bleed for every inch of dirt. The strategic board was cleared, the logistical pipelines were fully primed, and the heavy artillery was dialed in on the outskirts of the capital. The political stalling in Washington had run out the clock, leaving thousands of Americans and their Vietnamese allies trapped inside a tightening noose, waiting for the inevitable crack of dawn that would signal the beginning of the end. 38 miles east of Saigon, sitting squarely on the asphalt ribbon of Highway 1, was the provincial capital of Xuan Loc. It was a dusty, unremarkable town surrounded by sprawling rubber plantations, but in April 1975, it became the anvil upon which the North Vietnamese army intended to smash the last remnants of the South Vietnamese military. The NVA 4th Corps, commanded by Major General Hoang Cam, rolled toward Xuan Loc with 3 full infantry divisions, the 6th, the 7th, and the 341st, backed by an entire regiment of T-54 tanks and massive artillery support. They expected to roll right through the town in a matter of hours. Defending Xuan Loc was the ARVN 18th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Le Minh Dao. Historically, the 18th had a reputation as a lackluster unit, often mocked by other South Vietnamese commanders, but Dao had spent the last year forging his men into a hardened, disciplined force. He knew Xuan Loc was the gateway to the capital. If the town fell, the highway to Saigon was wide open, offering a high-speed avenue of approach for communist armor. To understand the bloodbath that unfolded at Xuan Loc, we have to look at the tactical geometry of urban anti-tank warfare. The NVA doctrine at this stage heavily favored Soviet-style deep battle tactics, utilizing combined arms where infantry rode on the decks of T-54 tanks, dismounting only when contact was made. The T-54 was a brute force instrument. It featured 200 millimeters of cast steel armor on its turret front and was armed with a 100 millimeter D-10T rifled gun capable of punching through any bunker the ARVN could build. But tanks have a fatal flaw in urban environments, which is limited visibility. A buttoned-up tank crew is effectively looking at the world through a handful of narrow glass prisms. General Dao understood this limitation perfectly. He ordered his men to dig in deep, creating a labyrinth of spider holes, reinforced basements, and interlocking fields of fire within the town's concrete buildings. He stripped his units of every available M72 LAW, the American-made light anti-tank weapon, and distributed them to his frontline infantry. The M72 LAW is a fascinating piece of disposable infantry ordnance. It is a 66 millimeter unguided rocket packed into a fiberglass and aluminum tube that weighs just 5.5 pounds. You pull the pins, extend the tube, pop up the rudimentary sights, and fire. The shaped charge warhead can penetrate about 300 millimeters of steel armor, but its effective range against a moving target is barely 200 meters. To kill a T-54, an ARVN soldier had to wait until the 36-ton steel monster was practically breathing on him, aim for the thinner side or rear armor, and pull the trigger. Firing a rocket launcher from inside a concrete room is a terrifying proposition. The backblast from the rocket motor creates a massive overpressure wave that bounces off the walls, rupturing eardrums and filling the room with blinding, choking smoke. Yet the men of the 18th Division did exactly this, day after day. When the NVA tanks rolled into the narrow streets of Xuan Loc, they were ambushed from all sides. ARVN infantrymen engaged in brutal point-blank firefights, stripping the NVA infantry off the tanks with M16 and M60 machine gun fire, while tank killer teams stepped out of the rubble to blast the blind and expose T-54s. Why throw human waves and precious armor into a fortified meat grinder when you have the numerical superiority to simply bypass the town? The answer lies in the unforgiving reality of military logistics. Highway 1 was the only paved artery capable of supporting the massive tonnage of artillery shells, diesel fuel, and heavy bridging equipment the NVA needed to breach Saigon's inner defenses. You cannot rout a mechanized army of 130,000 men through muddy rubber plantations and expect them to maintain momentum. General Van Tien Dung had to control that road, and General Dow was standing right in the middle of it. The defense of Xuan Loc is the South Vietnamese equivalent of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. Just like the American 101st Airborne Division, holding the vital crossroads town in the freezing Ardennes forest against overwhelming German armor, the ARVN 18th Division held the line against impossible odds. They were surrounded, outgunned, and taking horrific casualties, but they refused to break, buying precious time for the panicked capital behind them. But unlike Bastogne, there was no George Patton rushing up from the south to break the siege. The 18th Division was entirely on its own. To support the desperate defenders, the South Vietnamese Air Force, the VNAF, pulled out their ultimate trump card. With their heavy artillery outranged and being systematically destroyed by NVA 130mm counter-battery fire, the ARVN turned to the sky. They loaded C-130 Hercules transport planes with BLU-82 Daisy cutters. The BLU-82 was a monstrous 15,000-pound conventional bomb originally designed to instantly clear helicopter landing zones in the dense jungle. It was packed with 12,600 pounds of GSX, a slurry of ammonium nitrate, aluminum powder, and polystyrene. The bomb was pushed out the back of the cargo ramp on a pallet, floating down on a parachute. A 38-inch fuse extender protruding from the nose ensured the bomb detonated just above the ground. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic. It created an overpressure wave of 1,000 pounds per square inch, instantly vaporizing everything within a 300-foot radius and creating a lethal shockwave that ruptured internal organs for hundreds of yards beyond that. The VNAF dropped these massive bombs directly onto NVA staging areas and troop concentrations in the rubber plantations outside Xuan Loc. The devastation was absolute, wiping out entire NVA battalions in a blinding flash and a mushroom cloud that could be seen from Saigon. Despite the heroic defense and the tactical deployment of weapons of mass destruction, the math of attrition was heavily stacked against the ARVN. By April 16th, General Dung realized his frontal assaults were bleeding his Fourth Corps dry. He shifted his tactics, bypassing the town with his main armored elements while leaving a massive artillery force behind to pound Xuan Loc into dust. The NVA rained over 20,000 artillery shells onto the defensive positions. The ARVN 18th Division, having suffered over 30% casualties out of ammunition, and with their medical supplies completely exhausted, was finally ordered to withdraw on April 20. They executed a fighting retreat under the cover of darkness, slipping through the NVA encirclement. They had held off a force 3 times their size for nearly 2 weeks, destroying over 40 NVA tanks and inflicting thousands of casualties. It was a brilliant tactical stand, but strategically, the dam had burst. The road to Saigon was now wide open. With Xuan Loc secured, the North Vietnamese Politburo ordered the final phase of the Ho Chi Minh campaign to commence on April 26. The NVA forces organized into 5 massive columns, a mechanized noose designed to strike Saigon from every point of the compass simultaneously. The objective was not just to capture the city, but to annihilate the remaining ARVN forces in place, preventing them from retreating into the Mekong Delta to wage a protracted guerrilla war. The eastern column pushed down Highway 1. The northern column drove down Highway 13 from Binh Duong. The northwestern column attacked through Cu Chi, the site of the famous tunnel networks. The western and southern columns maneuvered through the swampy terrain of the Long An province to cut off Highway 4, the only escape route to the Delta. As the ground forces tightened the perimeter, the NVA moved to neutralize the last remaining advantage the South Vietnamese possessed, which was the airspace. The North Vietnamese anti-aircraft regiments pushed forward, bringing their lethal AA-7 Grail shoulder-fired missiles and ZSU-2344 Shilka self-propelled anti-aircraft guns to the very edge of the city. The SA-7, known to the Soviets as the Strela II, was a first-generation man-portable air defense system, or MANPADS. It used a rudimentary uncooled infrared seeker head that locked onto the hot exhaust of an aircraft engine. While it was easily spoofed by flares and had a relatively small warhead, its mere presence on the battlefield completely altered the tactical airspace. To avoid the SA-7s, ARVN A-37 Dragonfly attack jets and UH-1 Huey helicopters were forced to fly at higher altitudes, drastically reducing the accuracy of their unguided bombs and rockets. If they dove low to deliver close air support, they flew directly into the teeth of the ZSU-23-4s. The Shilka is a terrifying machine, a lightly armored tracked vehicle mounting 4 radar-guided 23mm autocannons capable of spitting out 4,000 rounds per minute. It creates a literal wall of high-explosive fragmentation in the sky. The VNAF pilots were flying suicide missions, and their numbers dwindled rapidly. The death blow to the South Vietnamese Air Force came not from the ground but from within. On the afternoon of April 28th, a flight of 3 A-37 Dragonfly attack jets appeared in the skies over Tan Son Nhut Air Base, the massive military and civilian airport adjacent to Saigon. The tower operators assumed they were returning ARVN pilots. They were wrong. The flight was led by Nguyen Thanh Trung, a sleeper agent and defector who had stolen an ARVN aircraft weeks earlier and trained NVA pilots to fly captured American jets. The A-37s rolled in and dropped Mark 82 500-pound bombs directly onto the flight line, destroying parked aircraft and igniting massive fuel fires. The psychological impact of this strike was devastating. It proved that nowhere in Saigon was safe, not even the nerve center of the South Vietnamese military. What happens when the busiest military airport in the world, the only viable extraction point for fixed-wing aircraft, suddenly becomes a cratered, burning graveyard? The entire calculus of the American evacuation plan is instantly vaporized, leaving only rotary-wing aircraft to do the heavy lifting. The systematic dismantling of Tan Son Nhut's runways and parked aircraft was a textbook preemptive strike, mirroring the Israeli Air Force's Operation Focus during the opening hours of the 1967 Six-Day War. If you kill the birds in their nests, you own the sky, and you blind your enemy. The NVA understood this perfectly. They followed up the airstrike with a massive artillery and rocket barrage. At 3:58 a.m. on April 29, the darkness over Saigon was shattered by the screech of incoming 122mm rockets. The 122mm rocket is a brutal area denial weapon. Fired from simple, easily concealed tripod tubes or truck-mounted launchers, they are highly inaccurate but carry a devastating 40-pound high-explosive warhead. The NVA fired hundreds of these rockets into Tan Son Nhut, targeting the runways, the control tower, and the Defense Attaché Office compound where thousands of American and Vietnamese evacuees were huddled. The tarmac became a slaughterhouse. 2 U.S. Marine security guards, Corporal Charles McMahon and Lance Corporal Darwin Judge, were killed instantly when a rocket slammed into their checkpoint. They were the last American servicemen killed in action on the ground in Vietnam. Out on the flight line, a massive C-130 transport plane, fully loaded with refugees, was struck at by a rocket as it taxied for takeoff. The aircraft erupted in a massive fireball, incinerating everyone on board. The runways were quickly pockmarked with deep craters, littered with the burning wreckage of F-5 Tiger fighters and C-119 flying boxcars. In the midst of this inferno, a handful of VNA pilots attempted one last desperate defense. A C-119 Gay Stinger gunships, slow-moving twin-engine cargo planes, heavily modified with 20mm Vulcan rotary cannons, managed to get airborne. They orbited the perimeter of the airbase in the pre-dawn darkness, pouring thousands of rounds of high-explosive incendiary ammunition into the NVA rocket positions. For a brief moment, the devastating firepower of the Stingers silenced the rocket tubes. But as the sun rose over the smog-choked city, the slow-moving gunships became easy targets against the morning sky. NVA infantrymen shouldered their SA-7 missiles. The infrared seekers locked onto the hot exhaust of the Stinger's radial engines. Missiles streaked upward, slamming into the wings and fuselages of the gunships. Spectators on the ground watched in horror as the giant aircraft folded in half, trailing fire and smoke, and plummeted into the urban sprawl below. With the destruction of the gunships, the South Vietnamese Air Force effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. On the ground, the situation was equally desperate. The NVA armored columns had reached the immediate outskirts of the city. At the Newport Bridge, a vital crossing over the Saigon River just a few miles from the city center, elements of the ARVN Airborne Division made a final stand. They dug in with a handful of remaining M48 Patton tanks, their 90mm guns trained on the eastern approach. When the lead elements of the NVA 2nd Corps attempted to cross the bridge, the ARVN paratroopers unleashed a withering crossfire. The heavy armor-piercing rounds of the Pattons punched through the lead T-54s, leaving them burning on the asphalt and blocking the advance. For several hours, the bridge became a chaotic choke point of burning metal, screaming engines, and the relentless chatter of heavy machine gun fire. But the NVA simply possessed too much mass. They brought up their 130mm artillery and began systematically reducing the ARVN defensive bunkers to rubble. Ammunition for the M48s dwindled to nothing. The paratroopers, out of anti-tank rockets and taking heavy casualties from artillery airbursts, were slowly pushed back, street by street, alley by alley. The tactical collapse of the outer perimeter sent a shockwave of sheer panic through the streets of Saigon. The population, swollen to over 3 million by refugees fleeing the northern provinces, realized the end was no longer a matter of weeks or days, but hours. Traffic gridlocked as terrified civilians attempted to reach the port, the airport, or the American embassy. ARVN soldiers, realizing the fight was lost, began shedding their uniforms in the streets, tossing their M16 rifles into the gutters to avoid execution by the advancing communists. The command and control structure of the South Vietnamese military completely evaporated. General Sao Van Vien, the chief of the Joint General Staff, resigned and fled the country. President Duong Van Minh, who had only been in office for a matter of hours after taking over from the fleeing President Thieu, sat in the Independence Palace waiting to surrender. The mighty mechanized army that the United States had spent a decade and billions of dollars building was dissolving into chaos. Inside the walls of the United States Embassy, the atmosphere was a toxic mixture of adrenaline, exhaustion, and disbelief. Ambassador Graham Martin, a man who had stubbornly refused to believe Saigon would fall, was finally forced to confront the smoking reality of Tan Son Nhut. The runways were destroyed. The fixed-wing evacuation plan, which was supposed to calmly fly tens of thousands of at-risk Vietnamese and American personnel out of the country, was dead in the water. The embassy compound was entirely surrounded by a sea of tens of thousands of desperate Vietnamese citizens, pressing against the iron gates, begging for salvation. The small detachment of U.S. Marines tasked with guarding the compound found themselves outmanned by a ratio of 1,000 to 1, holding the line with nothing but concertina wire, tear gas, and the butts of their rifles. The radio crackled with frantic reports from the Defense Attaché office, confirming that NVA armor was within striking distance of the city center. The clock had run out. The skies were filled with the smoke of burning aviation fuel and the distant rhythmic thud of approaching artillery. High above the chaos, the command was given, setting into motion the largest, most dangerous, and most chaotic helicopter evacuation in the history of human warfare. The signal to execute that command was not a blaring military siren, but a surreal broadcast crackling over armed forces radio. The announcer stated that the temperature in Saigon was 105 degrees and rising, followed immediately by Bing Crosby singing White Christmas. This bizarre pre-arranged audio trigger was the undeniable death knell for the American presence in Vietnam, initiating Operation Frequent Wind. The logistical undertaking of this operation was staggering, a vertical extraction of thousands of human beings from a hostile urban environment using a fleet of heavy-lift helicopters. The workhorse of this desperate airlift was the Sikorsky CH-53 Sea Stallion, a massive twin-engine beast of a machine. Weighing in at 38,000 pounds, fully loaded and powered by two General Electric T-64 turboshaft engines producing nearly 4,000 shaft horsepower each, the Sea Stallion was designed to carry 38 combat equipped troops. On April 29th, these helicopters were routinely crammed with up to 90 panicked civilians and embassy personnel. The pilots were pushing the airframes far beyond their maximum gross weight limits, relying on the dense, humid air and sheer engine torque to literally drag the aircraft into the sky. How do you orchestrate a massive aerial retreat when your primary staging ground is a single embassy compound surrounded by a hostile army and tens of thousands of desperate refugees? You rely on the absolute brute force of Marine Corps aviation and the ironclad discipline of the infantrymen holding the perimeter. The flight path from the embassy to the waiting vessels of Task Force 76 in the South China Sea was a 40-minute gauntlet of terror. American pilots flew low over the dense jungle canopy and the meandering Saigon River, constantly scanning the ground for the telltale flash of an SA-7 surface-to-air missile or the tracer fire of heavy machine guns. The North Vietnamese Army anti-aircraft gunners had the American flight paths dialed in, but a localized, unspoken truce seemed to hold. The NVA command realized that shooting down American helicopters would only delay the U.S. withdrawal and potentially invite retaliatory airstrikes from the carrier battle groups offshore. They wanted the Americans gone, so they largely held their fire, watching the sky fill with the chaotic swarm of rotary wing evacuation. Out on the water, the United States Navy 7th Fleet has assembled an armada over 40 ships, including the aircraft carriers USS Midway, USS Enterprise, and USS Coral Sea. The flight decks of these massive vessels quickly became the scene of a logistical nightmare. It was not just American CH-53s and CH-46 Sea Knights landing on the decks. Dozens of South Vietnamese Air Force pilots, having stolen UH-1 Hueys and anything else that could fly, were swarming the fleet. They had packed their families into the helicopters and flown out to sea with no navigation equipment, simply following the American flight paths until they spotted the gray hulls of the warships. The Huey is a relatively small helicopter, but when you have dozens of them landing on a crowded deck simultaneously, space vanishes instantly. The deck crews were forced to make a ruthless billion-dollar decision. To clear the landing zones for incoming, fuel-starved helicopters, sailors, and Marines physically pushed perfectly functional $250,000 UH-1 Hueys over the edge of the flight decks, sending them crashing into the dark waters of the South China Sea. This frantic scramble over the water is the American equivalent of the Miracle of Dunkirk in 1940. At Dunkirk, the British Expeditionary Force was pinned against the English Channel by advancing German panzer divisions, relying on a hastily assembled patchwork fleet of naval destroyers and civilian pleasure craft for salvation. Off the coast of Vietnam, the sea was replaced by the sky, and the little ships of Dunkirk were replaced by Bell UH-1 helicopters, but the desperate calculus of survival remained exactly the same. You abandon your heavy equipment, you abandon your strategic position, and you sacrifice everything just to preserve human life. But unlike Dunkirk, which allowed the British Army to fight another day, Operation Frequent Wind was the final chapter. There was no regrouping, no counterattack, and no return to the continent. To understand why the South Vietnamese military collapsed so rapidly in those final weeks, we have to look beyond the tactical battlefield and analyze the colossal intelligence failures and economic strangulation that preceded the fall. The Central Intelligence Agency and the political leadership in Washington were operating under the delusion of a decent interval. They believed that even without American air support, the ARVN could hold the line long enough to force a negotiated political settlement with Hanoi. The CIA station chief in Saigon, Thomas Polgar, stubbornly clung to the idea that the NVA would pause their offensive to consolidate their gains. This was a catastrophic misread of Soviet-influenced military doctrine. The North Vietnamese were executing a classic deep battle operation, a doctrine that dictates continuous relentless momentum to shatter the enemy's operational depth before they can establish a new defensive line. You do not pause when your enemy is routing. You accelerate, you bypass strong points, and you drive the mechanized spear directly into their capital. The economic reality was even more brutal than the intelligence failures. The ARVN was built in the image of the United States military, a force heavily dependent on mechanized mobility, massive artillery expenditure, and overwhelming close air support. This is a highly effective way to wage war, but it is astronomically expensive. When the 1973 OPEC oil embargo hit, the global price of crude oil quadrupled. Suddenly, fueling a fleet of M48 Patton tanks and A-37 attack jets became a financial impossibility for the South Vietnamese government. Concurrently, the U.S. Congress drastically slashed military aid. The ARVN was a heavy industrialized military machine that suddenly found itself with no fuel, no spare parts, and no ammunition. You cannot fight a mechanized combined arms war on a guerrilla budget. We saw this exact same logistical starvation during the American Civil War with the fall of Richmond in 1865. The Army of Northern Virginia did not just lose because of Union battlefield victories. They lost because the Confederate rail network collapsed. Hyperinflation destroyed their currency, and the soldiers in the trenches of Petersburg were literally starving to death. When the logistics die, the army dies, and the capital burns. The ARVN in 1975 was no different. They were geographically isolated, economically bankrupt, and cut off from their primary supplier, while their enemy was receiving a continuous, uninterrupted flow of heavy armor, 130mm artillery shells, and surface-to-air missiles from the Soviet Union and China. Can a military force programmed for a decade to rely on overwhelming technological superiority suddenly pivot to fighting a war of attrition with empty supply depots? The brutal answer, written in the streets of Saigon, is an absolute no. When you build a proxy army, you are essentially installing a highly complex software program into foreign hardware. If you do not provide the continuous updates, the maintenance, and the electrical power to run that system, it will crash. The United States spent billions of dollars teaching the ARVN how to fight an American war. But when the Americans left, they expected the ARVN to fight a Vietnamese war using American tactics without American resources. It was a strategic paradox that guaranteed a military collapse. The final hours of April 30th played out with a chilling mechanical inevitability. Inside the U.S. Embassy, the Marine security guards systematically fell back, locking heavy steel doors behind them as they retreated up the stairwells toward the roof. At 07:53 a.m., the final CH-46 Sea Knight helicopter carrying the last detachment of Marines lifted off the embassy roof and banked away toward the sea. The American war in Vietnam was officially over. Less than 3 hours later, the mechanized spearhead of the North Vietnamese Army entered the heart of the city. At 10:45 a.m., Tank 390, a Chinese-made Type 59 main battle tank, which is a direct copy of the Soviet T-54, revved its V-12 diesel engine and smashed through the wrought iron gates of the Independence Palace. The heavy steel tracks crushed the manicured lawn as NVA infantrymen swarmed the grounds, raising the flag of the National Liberation Front over the balcony. The 24-hour death spiral of Saigon was complete. The Fall of Saigon is a masterclass in the unforgiving nature of mechanized warfare and the brutal reality of logistics. It proves that technological superiority and tactical training are completely irrelevant if the political will to sustain supply lines evaporates. Wars are declared by politicians sitting in air-conditioned rooms. They are fought and paid for by the blood of the infantrymen in the mud, but they are ultimately won or lost by the quartermasters. When the fuel stops flowing and the artillery shells run out, the best army in the world is nothing more than a collection of heavily armed targets. Thank you for diving into the tactical realities of this historic collapse with us today. Before you go, I want to hear your strategic assessment down in the comments. What do you believe was the primary cause of the sudden and catastrophic collapse of the South Vietnamese military in 1975? Was it A, the complete withdrawal of United States air support and the drastic reduction in military funding? Was it B, the massive, uninterrupted logistical and mechanized backing of the North Vietnamese Army by the Soviet Union and China? Or was it C, the systemic corruption, poor leadership, and lack of morale within the South Vietnamese government itself? Drop your answer, A, B, or C, in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button to keep the historical firepower coming and stay sharp.